I need to back up a little before I get to that night, because if I just start from the moment Sergeant Varro walked into the vampire ward, none of it makes sense. You think he was crazy. You think he just did it because he felt like it, or because he had some kind of death wish, which, look, I'm not saying Marcus Varro doesn't have a complicated relationship with caution. He absolutely does. But what he did that night wasn't reckless. It was just Marcus. And once I explain who Marcus is, I think it'll click. We'd been deployed to the Outer Rim for 7 months by that point. The 9th Frontier Battalion, that's 48 humans, 2 Gret liaisons, and a logistics AI that we'd named Gerald because calling it by its actual designation felt like shouting into the void. We were stationed on Kareth 9 not because we were needed there exactly, but because the Galactic Compact requires human military presence at all neutral medical stations within 20 light minutes of any active dispute zone. Legal technicality, basically. We were there to fulfill a treaty clause and drink bad ration coffee and try not to embarrass the Confederation. Kareth 9 is a medical station, not a warship. It's shaped like a mushroom if someone sat on it, this wide, flat observation deck on top, a long cylindrical spine going down, and then a cluster of treatment wings fanning out at the bottom like roots. The station served 7 species, had rotating staff from 11 different planets, and smelled like antiseptic and something that the Golvari nurses used on their patients that I can only describe as warm metal and distant rain. Not unpleasant, actually, just strange. Everything about Kareth 9 was strange. Marcus was assigned to security detail for the station's exterior dock, basically walking the same 3 corridors for 12-hour shifts and checking credentials for incoming transport ships. It sounds boring because it was. He'd been doing it for 4 months. He'd gotten very good at Galactic Standard card games and had learned how to say, "Please stop that," in 9 different languages, including 2 that technically didn't use words. The Veth delegation arrived on day 211 of our deployment. The Veth ascendancy, and I'm going to try to explain this without using the word vampire immediately, because that's not quite accurate and it tends to make people miss the important parts. The Veth are a hemovoric species. They are tall, bilaterally symmetrical with a humanoid body plan, which means they look uncomfortably like tall, pale humans with too many joints in their fingers and eyes that reflect light the wrong way. They consume blood as their primary nutrient source. Not exclusively, they can eat other things, but blood is to them what protein is to humans. They need it. Without it, they deteriorate fast, and they deteriorate badly. So yes, functionally vampires. The whole galaxy figured this out about 3 centuries ago, and a lot of political noise was made about it. And eventually everyone just kind of settled into the diplomatic reality that the Veth ascendancy controlled 6 inhabited systems and had a navy that nobody wanted to fight. So the word vampire got quietly retired from official documents and replaced with hemovoric ascendancy citizens. Marcus called them vampires from day one, and nobody corrected him because, again, he wasn't wrong. The Veth delegation came in on an ascendancy medical transport, a sleek, dark ship that always looked to me like it was trying to look like a weapon even though it wasn't. 6 ascendancy guard, 2 medical technicians, and Princess Iravel Veth Sorn. She was the daughter of the ascendancy's high sovereign, 3rd in the line of succession, and she was dying. The official word was systemic collapse. The Veth med techs were tight-lipped about specifics, but what I pieced together from station gossip and medical staff whispers was this. Princess Iravel had contracted a bloodborne pathogen, one of the engineered kinds, the kind that targets species-specific biology, the kind that somebody makes when they want to hurt a specific type of person. Whatever it was, it had been attacking her blood's capacity to carry nutrition to her cells for weeks, and by the time they got her to Kareth 9, she was critical. The Ascendancy's own medics couldn't fix it. They needed the neutral station's full pathogen lab, which had equipment that the Ascendancy military vessels didn't carry. She was 17 years old by Veth reckoning, which translates to about 22 human standard years, give or take. I didn't know any of this the night Marcus walked into her ward. I found out later, same as everyone else. This is transcribed from an audio recording, not typed. He was speaking aloud. The background noise is ventilation systems and distant medical equipment. I can't sleep again. I'm going to walk the south corridor because if I lie here looking at the ceiling for one more hour, I'm going to lose my mind. The new ship came in tonight. Veth. Big deal apparently. I heard Akafar say something about royalty. I don't know much about the Veth except that they're the ones who negotiated the Karath Accord, and that Lieutenant Brennan says their military is genuinely nothing to mess with, which I believe because the guard that came off that transport tonight moved like people who know exactly how to use the space around them. Professional. Disciplined. I respect that, even if I'm not supposed to say so. South Corridor is quiet. Stations running on night cycle. Emergency lighting only, that orange amber glow that makes everything look like early morning. Most of the treatment wings are sealed. Except the one at the end. The Veth wing. They sealed it off fast. The guard set up a perimeter within about 6 minutes of docking, which is genuinely impressive work. But the seal isn't total. There's a gap at the emergency access panel near Junction 7C, and I can see through the observation window from the auxiliary corridor if I angle right. I know I shouldn't be looking. I'm going to look anyway. The patient they brought in is young. That's the first thing. Young and very pale even for a Veth. She's lying in one of the station's adjustable beds, and the Veth med techs have her connected to a monitoring system I don't recognize, probably their own equipment, not station standard. She's got IV lines in both arms. Her eyes are closed. The guard are standing perimeter inside the ward. That's 5 individuals in full ascendancy armor, matte black, articulated at the shoulders and hips, with those distinctive angular helmets that make them look like they have angular cheekbones even under the metal. The 6th guard is outside the ward door, standing still in a way that trained soldiers know how to stand still. Nobody else would notice that kind of stillness. I notice it because I do it myself sometimes, in long shifts. It's the stillness of someone who's decided that moving isn't useful. One of the med techs is talking to someone on a communicator. She keeps pausing. She keeps looking at the patient. Her posture is saying something I recognize from field medics back home, that specific exhausted tilt that says I've done everything I know how to do. I watch for a few minutes, then I go back to my bunk. I don't sleep. Continuation, Corporal Akafar's testimony. At 4:10 station time, the Veth medical technician, her name is Soveth, I found out later, Senior Medtech Soveth Drow, came out of the sealed ward and asked the station's duty officer if Karath 9 had any blood processing equipment compatible with Veth biology. The duty officer that night was Ensign Palav, a young Gret with absolutely no experience in cross-species medicine. He panicked, quietly, and called the station's CMO, who called the on-call xenobiologist, who called everyone she knew with relevant expertise, and within about 20 minutes there were 7 people in the station's medical coordination room having a very urgent conversation about blood chemistry. The problem was specific. The pathogen had destroyed Princess Iravel's ability to use stored blood reserves. The ascendancy transport had plenty of blood stock, but the pathogen had essentially taught her immune system to reject processed blood. It recognized it as contaminated. Every time they tried to introduce stored blood, her body treated it like poison. The only way to feed her nutrition was with fresh, unprocessed blood straight from a living donor. But here's the thing the media reports got wrong later. She couldn't just use any fresh Veth blood. The pathogen had mutated in a specific way that made Veth blood, even fresh Veth blood, partially recognizable as contaminated. It wasn't a perfect block, but it was enough to reduce absorption by 90%. The ascendancy guard had already tried. 2 of them had donated. She'd nearly gone into cardiac arrest within minutes of intake. The xenobiologist, Dr. Tessa, a Marathi with 4 arms and the kind of methodical calm that makes you trust her immediately, figured out within about 2 hours what the workaround was. The pathogen was keyed to VETH biological markers. It had been designed specifically to target VETH blood chemistry, which meant that any blood without VETH markers would be, to the pathogen, invisible, undetectable, and to Iravel's compromised system, potentially absorbable. They needed non-VETH blood, fresh from a living donor. Kareth 9 had 7 species on staff. Dr. Tessa ran compatibility checks as fast as she could. Golvari, wrong protein chains. Marathi, iron content too low for VETH metabolism. Thren, blood carries a mild paralytic compound benign to Thren but toxic in VETH volumes. By 600, she'd eliminated 5 species from consideration. That left humans. Human blood, Dr. Tessa told the coordination room, was structurally compatible with VETH nutritional uptake at a rate of about 68%. Not perfect, but potentially enough in sufficient quantity to stabilize the princess through the next 72 hours while the lab worked on a pathogen treatment. The station's medical coordinator, a Golvari administrator named Bruven, immediately contacted the human battalion. He needed a volunteer donor, someone with O-negative blood type, or as close to universal as human biology allowed. He needed them now, because in his conservative estimate, Princess Iravel Vethsorn had about 4 hours left before her organs began failing in sequence. Lieutenant Brennan woke up to that call at 6:07. He woke me up at 6:08. I woke up Marcus at 6:09, and I want to say for the record, I did not tell him it was for the dying vampire princess. I told him the station needed a blood donor urgently, and his file showed he was O-negative and would he please get dressed. He was dressed in 45 seconds. He didn't ask questions. He just pulled on his jacket and said, "Which direction?" That was Marcus. I want to be honest about what I knew and when I knew it. When Akafer woke me up, I knew it was urgent because she had that particular tight voice she gets when something matters. I knew it was medical because she said, "blood donor," and she said, "now." I did not know it was for the princess until I was already in the medical coordination room and Dr. Tessa was showing me compatibility charts. Even then, I need to be clear, I would have done it regardless. I wasn't being heroic. I wasn't thinking about diplomacy or the Confederation or any of that. I was thinking that there was a person dying on this station, and I had something in my body that might help her not die, and the only question that mattered was whether there were any health risks to me that I hadn't been told about. Dr. Tessa was honest. She said the volume they'd need over the next 72 hours was significant. She said I'd feel exhausted and probably have headaches and would need iron supplements and rest. She said it wasn't nothing. I said okay. I need to explain something about how I think about this kind of decision because I know it looked impulsive to some people. It didn't feel impulsive to me. I've been donating blood since I was 17 years old back home in Enugu. My mother used to say that we don't own what's in our bodies, we just borrow it for a while, and if someone needs to borrow a piece of it, you give it freely. She said it about kidneys, actually. We have a family history of kidney disease, and she was always talking about living donors. But it applied here. The Veth guard outside the princess's ward did not want to let me in. I understood that. I was a human soldier in a foreign dignitary's medical space. From their perspective, I was an unknown variable in a situation where someone had already tried to assassinate their princess, because that's what this was. Somebody had deliberately infected her. The guard was operating at maximum threat sensitivity, letting a random human near her required, from their point of view, an enormous act of trust. The conversation between Dr. Tessa and the guard commander lasted about 11 minutes. I stood in the corridor and waited. I could see through the observation window that Iravel's monitors were showing numbers I couldn't read, but that Dr. Tessa, watching from beside me, kept making small, tight sounds at. Commander Rithav, that's the guard commander's name, Rithav Sorn Cashel, and I later found out he'd been with the princess's personal protection detail for 6 years. Commander Rithav finally opened the ward door. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said in galactic standard, "If you harm her, I will take your arm off at the shoulder." I said, "Fair enough." He blinked. I don't think that was the response he expected. I went in. Testimony, Commander Rithav Sorn Cashel, Veth Ascendancy Royal Guard. For the record, I do not regret the decision to allow the human inside. I want to make that clear before I describe my feelings at the time, which were complicated. The situation was this: Princess Iravel was failing. Her signs were degrading every 30 minutes in a clear downward curve. The station's xenobiologist had done everything correctly. She'd eliminated alternatives. She'd confirmed compatibility. She'd been honest about risks and probability. The math was clear. We had no other option that gave us better than 40% survival probability. And the human said yes without hesitation. That is not nothing. Whatever I thought of humans before that night, and I will confess that my opinion of human military personnel was not particularly high, based on my limited previous experience. What I saw when I looked at Sergeant Varro in that corridor was not what I expected. He was medium height, medium build. Dark skin, short hair, the kind of tired that comes from a long deployment rather than a long night. He was wearing his uniform jacket over what appeared to be a sleep shirt, which told me Corporal Akaffer had indeed woken him in the middle of the night. He had a scar above his left eyebrow that looked old, something from before the service, I thought. He was calm. That was the thing that I noticed most. The situation was, objectively, alarming. He was being asked to walk into a sealed ward full of Veth Royal Guard and donate blood to a dying member of the Ascendancy's ruling family. He was calm in the way that people are calm when they've made a decision and they're at peace with it. I've served the Ascendancy for 22 years. I know what different kinds of calm look like. There is performative calm, which is someone pretending not to be afraid. There is trained calm, which is someone who has learned to suppress fear through discipline. And then there is the rarer kind, the calm of someone who genuinely does not find the situation worth being afraid of, not because they're foolish, but because they've already resolved whatever question was generating the fear. Sergeant Varro had the third kind. I told him I would take his arm. He said fair enough. He walked into the princess's ward like he was walking into any room. I followed him. I did not take my hand off my weapon for the first hour. Personal account, Sergeant Marcus Varro continued. The Veth ward had been reconfigured from standard station spec. The lighting was lower, the Veth prefer it, I learned, because their light-sensitive eyes evolved for a world with a dimmer star. There were monitoring systems along the walls that I didn't recognize, and the air had that strange quality of rooms where a lot of careful, quiet work has been happening for a long time. The med techs barely looked at me when I came in. They were focused on the monitors. Iravel was in the bed nearest the far wall. She had her eyes open when I walked in. I don't know exactly what I expected, but I hadn't thought much about what she looked like. I'd been focused on the logistics, but I stopped when I saw her, just for a second, because she was clearly fighting. Whatever was happening to her body, she was awake, and she was watching the room, and her eyes tracked to me the moment I came through the door. Veth eyes don't have whites the same way human eyes do. The iris is large, takes up most of the eye. Hers were dark, somewhere between gray and green, with a quality of reflecting ambient light that I'd noticed in other Veth but was more pronounced in her, maybe because she was in a lower-lit room. She looked at me the way sick people look at strangers who have just walked into their hospital room, assessing, trying to decide if I was going to make the situation better or worse. She was young. I knew she was royalty. She was also just a young person lying in a medical bed, who was clearly exhausted and frightened, and trying very hard not to show either. Dr. Tessa explained the procedure to me again, with the Veth medtech Soveth translating for Iravel's benefit. The process was different from standard human blood donation. Because of Veth physiology, the intake couldn't be processed and bagged. It had to go from me directly into her system through a conversion apparatus that Dr. Tessa and Soveth had spent 3 hours jury-rigging from station equipment and Ascendancy med gear. I'd be connected to Iravel via a line. We'd need to be about a meter apart. Iravel, when Soveth explained this, turned to look at me again. She said something in Veth. Soveth translated. She says she doesn't want you to be afraid of her. I said, tell her I'm not. Soveth told her. Iravel made a small sound. It might have been a short laugh. I'm not entirely sure. Her face shifted in a way that I didn't have the vocabulary to read yet. I sat down in the chair they'd positioned beside her bed. The apparatus was set up. They connected me first, and then, with a degree of careful deliberateness that I understood was Soveth making sure her patient was ready, they connected Iravel. The first few minutes nobody spoke. The guard was standing around the room. Commander Rithav was directly behind me. Dr. Tessa was watching the monitors. Soveth was watching Iravel. And Iravel was looking at the ceiling. After about 5 minutes she turned her head and looked at me again. She said something. She asks if it hurts, Soveth said. A little, I said. Tell her it's fine. Iravel said something else. Soveth's expression shifted, something complicated that I couldn't read on a Marathi face. She says, Soveth said carefully, that she's sorry for inconveniencing you. I thought about that. Tell her the inconvenience is fine. Tell her I hope she feels better. There was a longer exchange after that, Iravel and Soveth talking quietly. I didn't catch any of it. I don't speak Veth. I sat there and kept still and watched the monitors show numbers that I still couldn't read, but that seemed to be making Soveth's posture relax, fractionally. After about 40 minutes, Iravel's eyes closed. She wasn't unconscious. When Soveth spoke to her, she responded. She was just resting. I stayed connected for another hour, and then Dr. Tessa declared the first session complete and disconnected me, and told me to drink this whole bottle of something that tasted like iron and citrus and eat the meal they'd prepared and sleep for at least 8 hours. I asked if she was going to be okay. Dr. Tessa did that thing again, that medic tilt. Ask me in 72 hours, she said. I went back to my bunk. I did not tell Akafar the details. I lay down and I fell asleep within 4 minutes, which is very fast for me, but I'd lost more blood than I'd usually lose on a donation back home, and my body had opinions about it. Patient Princess Iravel Veth Sorn. Age, 17 Veth Standard. Condition, hemovoric systemic collapse secondary to engineered pathogen infection. First human donor session completed. Duration, 1 hour 41 minutes. Donor, SGT, Marcus Varro, Human Confederation Army. Blood type, O-negative. Absorption rate achieved, 71% exceeding initial 68% projection. Patient vitals stabilizing. Marked improvement in cellular nutrition markers within 40 minutes of session initiation. Pathogen response to human marker-free blood, minimal as hypothesized. Assessment, positive. 2 additional sessions recommended at 18-hour intervals. Donor physical status within acceptable range. Minor hemoglobin reduction expected. Donor compliance complete. No adverse behavior noted. Personal note, not for official file. The soldier sat with her for almost 2 hours without flinching. He spoke to her through Soveth. At one point, I caught this from the monitor room, he said something that made her laugh. An actual laugh. I don't know what he said. Soveth didn't translate it for the record. But I've been watching Iravel's vitals for 3 days, and that laugh was the first moment her heart rate looked like a healthy person's. I need to say something about what the next 3 days were like, because the official account makes it sound very clean and sequential, and it wasn't. It was 3 days of sleeping and waking up and going back to that ward and sitting in that chair again, and drinking iron supplements that tasted terrible and watching the monitors shift, and feeling a little more tired each time, and trying to have conversations with a person I couldn't speak to directly. And somehow it was one of the more meaningful things I've ever done, which I didn't expect. The second session was at 2200 on day 212. She was awake when I came in and she looked marginally better. The gray, depleted quality of her face was less severe. She was sitting upright in the bed instead of lying flat, which Soveth told me was new since morning. Iravel looked at me when I came in and said something immediately. Soveth translated, "She says you came back." I said I would, I said. Soveth translated that. Iravel looked at me steadily for a moment, then she said something else. She says, humans say things and then do other things. She wasn't certain. I sat down in the chair. Tell her I understand that, and tell her that specifically I am not going to do that because I don't have a reason to. That started a conversation that lasted between Soveth translating back and forth, probably 40 minutes before we had to stop because the session had started and Soveth needed to focus on monitoring. We talked about nothing important. She asked where I was from. I said Earth, specifically a city called Enugu. She said she'd never heard of it. I said most people hadn't outside of humans. She asked what it was like. I said, hot, full of people. My mother made this soup with crayfish and she'd spend all day making it and you could smell it from the end of the street. And every time I come back home after a deployment, that smell is the first thing I look for. Soveth translated. Iravel was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Soveth translated slowly, like she was choosing words carefully. She says, there is a meal her mother's kitchen makes, a broth with spices from their home world. She could smell it from 3 corridors away when she was a child. She says she thinks she understands what you mean. I thought about that for a minute. About how you could be a human soldier from Enugu and a vampire princess from a 6th system ascendancy, and still be using the same language for homesickness without even trying to. Tell her I hope she gets to smell it again soon, I said. She turned her face away from me after Soveth translated that. I thought I'd said something wrong. Then Soveth said quietly, she's all right, she just needs a moment. I sat there and kept still. The monitors kept doing their thing. Testimony Corporal Akafer continued. I want to be clear that the rest of the battalion found out what Marcus was doing by day 213 at the latest, and the reaction was mixed, I'd say. Some people thought it was remarkable. Some people thought it was stupid. Private Ketterer said something along the lines of he volunteered to be vampire food. And that set off a whole separate argument that lasted about a day and a half. Lieutenant Brennan was concerned from a regulation standpoint. He called Marcus in and asked if he understood what he was doing, and Marcus said yes, and Brennan said, and you're doing it voluntarily with no coercion. And Marcus said yes, and Brennan said, then carry on, and that was the extent of the official battalion response. What I personally thought, watching this from the outside, was that Marcus had found something that he was good at that wasn't walking the same corridor 12 hours a day, and that it was filling something in him that had been a little empty. He doesn't complain about boring deployments. He's not that kind of person, but I know him, and the long quiet stretches, they wear on him in a way he doesn't talk about. He was not worn down by this. He was tired, yes. You can't donate that volume of blood and not be physically tired. But he came back from each session with this quality of presence that he doesn't usually have on the South Corridor, like he'd been doing something that actually mattered. I didn't say any of that to him at the time, but I noticed it. On day 213, the 3rd session, I asked him how she was doing. He said, better, I think. He said, she's funny, actually. I said, you're kidding. He said, "No, she's got this dry, very quiet sense of humor. You'd miss it if you weren't paying attention." He said, "She asked me today if humans always sit in chairs at weird angles, or if it's just me specifically." I stared at him. He grinned. He said, "I sit sideways, you know that. Everyone knows that." I said, "The dying vampire princess noticed that you sit sideways in chairs." He said, I do sit sideways in chairs." Personal account, Sergeant Marcus Varro continued. By the end of the third session, day 213, Dr. Tessa declared Iravel stable. Not recovered. The pathogen was still in her system and the lab was still working on a treatment, but stable. She was holding, and the immediate crisis had passed. Dr. Tessa told me I was done donating. She said 3 sessions was the reasonable limit given what my body had given over 72 hours, and that any further donations would need to wait at minimum 10 days. She said I needed to rest. I said, "Is she really going to be okay?" Tessa looked at her monitors for a long time. Then she said, "I think so. I think the lab will have something viable for the pathogen within 2 weeks. I think she has 2 weeks now." I said, "Good." I want to leave the ward. I need to be precise about this because it's become a point of some confusion in the reports. This was entirely routine. My medical role was finished. I had no reason to return to the Veth ward. I was, from every official standpoint, done. Iravel said something. I had my back to her. I was almost at the door. Soveth translated, and Soveth's voice was slightly careful in a way that it sometimes got when she was navigating diplomatic nuance. She asks if you are leaving. I said, "Yes, my part is done." Soveth translated. Long pause. Iravel spoke. Soveth translated again, and this time there was definitely something in her voice that I couldn't classify. She says she doesn't want you to. Medical observation. Soveth Drow, Senior Med Tech, Veth Ascendancy. Let me be clear about what happened in that moment, because the human's account of it is accurate, but it doesn't fully convey what was occurring biologically. Hemuvoric bond formation is a known Veth physiological response. It is not mystical. It is not a curse, as some of the more dramatic accounts have suggested. It is a biochemical reality of Veth nutrition and neurology. When a Veth takes blood from a living donor, not processed blood, not stored blood, but a living source direct transfer, there is a neurological response. The Veth body learns the donor. It registers the blood chemistry. It begins, over repeated exposures, to associate that specific biochemical signature with safety, with sustenance, with continued survival. Over 3 sessions across 72 hours, Princess Iravel's system had learned Sergeant Varro's blood chemistry very thoroughly. She was, by the end of the 3rd session, in early-stage hemuvoric bonding. This is not nothing. Hemuvoric bond formation is a significant biochemical event for Veth. It is not the same as the romantic or mystical bond some species attribute to their mating structures, but it is also not nothing. It creates an urgency, a sense of the bonded donor as important to continued well-being, that is very difficult to rationally override. Even for a disciplined, intelligent Veth, and Iravel was both, the biochemical signal is loud. She didn't want him to leave because her body was telling her that he was the reason she was alive, because her body was right. What she said in Veth was more specific than what I translated in that moment. I am going to be accurate about it here because the investigation deserves the full text. She said, "Please don't go yet. I'm not ready." I translated it as "she doesn't want you to." I was trying to soften it. I thought perhaps that the full statement would be alarming to a human soldier. I was wrong about that, I think. I don't believe it would have alarmed him. Personal account, Sergeant Marcus Varro continued. I stood at the door for a few seconds. Then I turned around. I went back and sat down in the chair beside her bed. I sat sideways, which apparently she had noticed. She looked at me. Her face was still pale, still tired, but something in it was different from when I'd first walked into this ward 3 days ago. There was less bracing in it, less of the particular kind of guardedness that sick people carry when they're fighting something and trying not to let anyone see how hard. I said through Soveth, "I'm not in a rush." She said something. Soveth said, "She says you should sleep, you look tired." I said, "You look worse." Soveth translated that with what I can only describe as professional neutrality. There was a pause. Then Iravel made that sound again, the one that might have been a laugh. Then she said something longer. Soveth was quiet while she translated in her head, and then she said, "She says, you are strange. She says she has met 12 heads of state, 47 diplomats, and 3 species she'd never encountered before the age of 17. She says none of them sat sideways in chairs." "Tell her that's their loss," I said. Iravel's expression shifted in a way that I was beginning to read a little, just barely. Something in the way the corners of her eyes moved. She was amused. I stayed for another 2 hours. We talked through Soveth about things that had nothing to do with medicine or politics or dying or blood. She asked me about Earth. I asked her about Veth Prime, which is what I called her home world, and which is not actually what they call it, but she seemed to find that characteristically human and not entirely objectionable. She asked why I joined the military. I told her honestly. I said I'd had no particular direction at 20, and the Army gave me one, and I'd found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was good at it and that I liked the people. She asked, "Do you miss home?" I said, "Every day, you." She was quiet for a moment after Soveth translated that. Then she said something that Soveth translated quietly, like the words were a little fragile. She says she's been traveling since she was 14. Diplomatic tour, treaty negotiations, representation duties. She says she sometimes thinks she misses home, but she's not certain she remembers it clearly enough to properly miss it. I thought about that. I said, tell her that the smell thing from before, that's what home is. It doesn't have to be visual. It doesn't even have to be complete. It just has to be the thing that makes you feel like yourself when you're too far from it." Soveth translated. Iravel didn't say anything for a long time. She looked at the ceiling. Then she looked at me. She said one word in Veth. Soveth said, "Thank you." The matter requiring formal documentation is as follows. Sergeant Marcus Varro's security detail posting officially concluded at the end of day 220. Under standard deployment rotation, Sergeant Varro was scheduled to rotate off-station aboard the resupply transport Meridian's Gate on day 222. Lieutenant Brennan filed the necessary transfer paperwork on day 218, as required. On day 220, Princess Iravel Vethsorn transmitted a formal diplomatic communication to the station administration, copied to the Human Confederation Battalion Command, and to the Galactic Diplomatic Corps Regional Office. The communication was filed under the Ascendancy Diplomatic Seal, and therefore carries the full legal weight of an official Ascendancy state communication. The communication stated that Princess Iravel Vethsorn formally requested that Sergeant Varro's departure be delayed until such time as she was medically cleared to leave the station herself, which Dr. Tessa estimated would be an additional 19 to 24 days. The communication did not use the word refuses, which is how this incident has been described in unofficial accounts. It was a formal request. The distinction matters. However, the Ascendancy Diplomatic Seal on a request of this nature carries what is called an Ascendancy Expectation Clause, a diplomatic convention stating that when a member of the Ascendancy ruling family makes a formal request through official channels, a noncompliance requires written justification submitted to both the Ascendancy High Court and the Galactic Diplomatic Corps within 72 hours. Which meant that if Lieutenant Brennan wanted to send Sergeant Varro home on the Meridian's Gate, he needed to write a formal diplomatic justification explaining why the needs of the human confederation outweighed a request from a princess of the Veth ascendancy. Lieutenant Brennan sat with that paperwork for about 3 hours before calling the Confederation's regional diplomatic office. The regional diplomatic office had an extremely interesting conversation with Lieutenant Brennan that I am not privy to the contents of, but following which Lieutenant Brennan came to the station administration and said that Sergeant Varro's transfer was being delayed pending diplomatic review. Personal account, Sergeant Marcus Varro continued. Nobody told me directly for about 4 hours. I found out because Akafer came into the mess with this expression on her face that she gets when something bizarre has happened, and she's not sure if it's wonderful or terrible. She said, the vampire princess filed a diplomatic hold on your transfer. I said, she what? Akafer said, officially it's a request. Technically it carries an expectation clause. Practically, it means you're not going anywhere for at least 3 weeks. I sat with that for a minute. I said, did anyone ask me? Akafer said, did anyone ask you what? I said, if I wanted to stay. She stared at me, do you? I thought about it honestly. The answer, when I checked it, surprised me a little. Or maybe it didn't. I don't know. I'd been going to her ward every day since the 3rd session. Not for medical reasons. Dr. Tessa had made clear my donation role was finished. I'd been going because Iravel had asked me to, through Soveth, and because I'd been going anyway, and then the asking and the going had merged into a routine that I had not examined very carefully. I said, that's not the point. The point is she should have asked me. Akafer nodded slowly. She said, are you angry? I said, I don't know yet. I need to go talk to her. Testimony. Soveth Drow continued. The sergeant came to the ward at 14:30 and asked to speak with Princess Iravel. This was not unusual. He had been coming to the ward every day. What was different was his face. He was not angry exactly. He was deliberate. The same kind of deliberate that the guard recognized as serious, because Commander Rithav signaled the internal team at the door. I told Commander Rithav to stand down. I could read the human well enough by then to know he wasn't going to do anything aggressive. He was going to say something. He sat in the chair. He didn't sit sideways. He sat straight and put his forearms on his knees, and he looked at Iravel directly and said, we need to talk about what you did. I translated. Iravel held still in the bed. She was sitting up fully now, had been for several days, her color much improved, the depleted quality almost gone. She met his eyes. He said, you filed a diplomatic hold on my transfer without asking me first, and I need you to know the reason I'm not leaving is not because of the hold. I'm not staying because a piece of paper says I have to. I need you to understand the difference. I translated carefully. Iravel was quiet. He said, I would have stayed if you'd asked me, just asked me. I want you to know that. Long pause. He said, but you didn't ask. And I need to know why. Iravel looked at her hands for a moment. When she looked up, she spoke in Veth, and I translated as she went. She says, she was afraid you would say no. He waited. She says, she has said please to a great many people in her life. She says it has not always worked. She says the diplomatic mechanism was something she knew would work. She used the thing she knew. He was quiet for a long moment. Iravel was watching his face. She'd gotten better at reading his face too over the past 10 days. He said, that's honest. I appreciate that. He said, but I want you to know from now on, if you want something from me, you can ask. Just ask. I'll tell you yes or no honestly. Iravel was quiet for several seconds. Then she said something that I translated with care. She says, humans where you come from, they say please and they mean it. He said, some of them, the ones I try to be like. Another pause. Iravel said something short. She says, all right. He sat with that for a moment. Then he settled back in the chair. He went back to sitting sideways. Iravel noticed. Something in her face softened. She said, "You always sit like that." He said, "It's more comfortable." She said, "It's very strange." He said, "I've heard that." Personal account. Sergeant Marcus Varro continued. That was the conversation where something changed, though I didn't have a word for it yet. We'd been talking every day for over a week by that point, through Soveth, about everything and nothing. And I'd thought of it as companionable, the particular kind of companionability that comes from an unusual situation, from being the only person of your species in a room, and finding that the person across from you is interesting anyway, maybe because of that. What changed after that conversation was something in how I understood what we were doing. She was afraid I'd say no. She'd used a mechanism instead of her voice because the mechanism was safer. She was 17, 22, adjusted, and she was sick, and she'd had someone try to kill her, and she was a very long way from home, and she'd found one person in that station who talked to her like she was a person instead of a problem to be solved, and she was afraid to just ask. I knew what that felt like, not the royalty part, but the afraid to just ask part. I knew that very well. She did ask me after that. Every day around 1300 would I come visit her. I always said yes. The conversations got longer. They got more direct, partly because Iravel was getting stronger and had more energy for them, and partly because we'd stopped performing for each other, if we'd ever been. She started asking Soveth to teach her phrases in galactic standard so she could speak to me without the translation delay. She had a good ear. Within a week she could say about 30 phrases clearly. The first time she said something directly to me, without Soveth it was, "You sit sideways again today." I said, "It's more comfortable." She said, "I know, you told me." There was a guard stationed in the ward at all times. Commander Rithav was often there personally, not because he distrusted me anymore. I think we'd moved past that around day 6, but because he was protective in the way people are protective when something has already nearly been taken from them, and they're not willing to let their guard down. I respected that. I left space for it. Commander Rithav never warmed up to me exactly, but on day 16, he told me, in stiff galactic standard, that the station ration coffee I'd started bringing to the ward was an improvement on the Ascendancy rations. He did not say thank you, but he accepted the cup. I considered that significant progress. Testimony. Commander Rithav Sornkashel continued. The coffee was fine. I want the record to note that I stated it was an improvement over the Ascendancy rations, not that it was good. The distinction is important. What I observed over those 19 days, and I was observing carefully, because that is my function, was that Princess Iravel's recovery accelerated measurably once she was no longer in immediate crisis. Dr. Tessa attributed this to the pathogen treatment, which was working. I believe the pathogen treatment was the primary cause. I also believe it was not the only cause. The princess she has always been bright. Quick. She learned everything she was ever taught faster than her tutors expected. But diplomatic tour and treaty negotiations, especially at the age she began them, are a particular kind of wearing. You are performing a version of yourself all the time. You are representing something larger than yourself all the time. Even your most natural moments are observed. Sergeant Varro had no political stake. He had nothing to gain from her good opinion. He was not impressed by her title, not in the way that translates into performance, into careful handling. He was interested in her specifically, in what she thought, what she'd seen, what she found funny, what she missed. I watched her laugh in that ward in a way I had not seen her laugh in 2 years of travel. Not a performed laugh. The real one, which is quieter than people expect. I began to be concerned around day 14, not because Sergeant Varro had done anything wrong, because I could see where this was going, and I did not know how to address it in a way that protected her from an outcome that seemed, to me, structurally difficult. He was going to leave. Eventually, he was going to leave. The diplomatic hold would expire, the Confederation would want their soldier back, and he would go. I did not know what that was going to do to her. Personal account, Sergeant Marcus Varro continued. Around day 18 of the extended stay, Iravel and I had a conversation that Soveth wasn't present for, because Iravel had by that point developed enough galactic standard to manage a slow conversation, and Soveth had left to handle something in the med room. Iravel said, "I know you have to go." I said, "I know too." She was looking at the observation window across the room. You could see the stars from there, just barely, at the right angle. Station exterior lights did funny things with the view. I'd noticed her looking at that window a lot. She said in careful galactic standard, "When you are gone, will you remember this?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I am afraid I will not be." She paused, working through the language. "I am afraid it will not be the same, after." I said, "The same as what?" She looked at me, she said, "As it is now, talking to you, being easy." That's the word she used, easy. I turned that over in my head. I said, "It probably won't be exactly the same. But that's not the same as it being gone." She thought about that. "You will be far." I said, "Yes." She said, "Far is hard." I said, "Far is hard, but far isn't permanent." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said slowly in her careful galactic standard, "You would come back." I said, "I don't know what my deployment schedule looks like, but I'd try." She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she looked back at the window. She said, "I will ask, not file a thing, ask." I said, "That's all I need." I need to explain how this became an international incident, because I was working in a regional GDC office when the story broke, and I watched it happen in real time, and it was extraordinary in the most literal sense of the word. The first report came from a Golvari news service. A crew member aboard a trade vessel that had docked at Kareth 9 for a routine medical resupply saw Sergeant Varro walking the station corridors on day 20, well past his original departure date, and checked with station records because something seemed off about a human soldier being there past rotation schedule. Station records are technically public in broad strokes. The Ascendancy's diplomatic hold was on file. The news service found it and filed a story. The headline, translated into galactic standard, was approximately, "Human soldier detained by VETH Ascendancy after medical incident." Within 6 hours, this was wrong in every major specific. Varro was not detained. He was not being held against his will. The diplomatic hold was a legal formality and he could technically contest it. The Veth Ascendancy had not imprisoned him, but the headline was out. The second wave of coverage came from human media, which picked up the Golvari report and made it considerably more dramatic. The phrase "blood donor held captive" appeared. There were calls to the Human Confederation government. There were diplomatic rumblings. And then something happened that nobody in media expected. Sergeant Varro gave a statement. He was not supposed to give a statement. He hadn't cleared it with Lieutenant Brennan. He hadn't cleared it with the Confederation Diplomatic Office. He sat down with a station comm unit, and he recorded a video, and he uploaded it to the Galactic Public Broadcast Network at 8:45 station time on day 21. The video is 17 seconds long. He says in it, "My name is Marcus Varro. I'm a sergeant in the Human Confederation Army. Nobody is holding me captive. I'm exactly where I want to be. The princess saved my life, actually, gave me a reason to be useful on a very long, boring deployment. I'd appreciate if everyone could leave her alone." He said the princess saved my life. He reversed it. He made her the actor. I have thought about that framing a great deal since. It was either very calculated or completely instinctive, and knowing what I now know of Sergeant Varro, I think it was both at the same time. The video was seen by 31 million individuals, across 14 species within 48 hours. Personal account, Sergeant Marcus Varro continued. I want to clarify what I meant by that, because it got a lot of attention that I wasn't expecting. I said she saved my life. People thought I meant it metaphorically, that she gave meaning to the deployment or whatever. That's part of it, but I meant it literally too. Here's what I mean. I've been in uniform for 7 years. Outer Rim deployment is a specific kind of hard. It's not combat hard. It's the other hard. The grinding, quiet kind where you keep going because you're supposed to keep going, and you lose the thread of why you're doing it somewhere around month 4, and you don't get it back until you rotate home, and then you go again. 7 years of that builds something in you that's functional but a little hollowed out. I didn't know I was hollowed out until I sat in that chair. Until I had something to do that was clearly, directly useful to a specific person who I could see and hear, and who was getting better in front of me. Until I had conversations that mattered in the way conversations matter when someone's actually talking to you and not through you. She gave that to me. I gave her blood. She gave me, I don't know exactly what word to use, presence. The reminder that you can be somewhere specific and have it mean something specific. I told Akafer some of this on day 22. She looked at me for a long time. She said, Marcus. I said, what? She said, you know this is going to be complicated. I said, most things are. She said, not most things, this specifically. I thought about that. I said, I know. She said, okay. She paused. Is it worth it? I said yes without thinking about it, which is usually when you know the honest answer. Testimony. Corporal Akafer continued. After the video, the political situation got very loud very fast, and then, this is the part nobody expected, it got quiet. The Ascendancy released a statement. The official statement, under the High Sovereign Seal, acknowledged the incident, acknowledged the diplomatic hold, and stated that the Ascendancy regarded Sergeant Varro's actions as reflecting, and I'm quoting from the translated official text, a depth of character consistent with the highest traditions of cross-species humanitarian service. That's diplomatic language. What it means, translated into plain speech, is we're not going to pretend this was an ordinary thing. This was remarkable, and we're saying so officially. The Human Confederation released a statement the next day. It was shorter. It said that the Confederation was proud of Sergeant Varro's actions and looked forward to continuing dialogue with the Veth Ascendancy on matters of mutual concern. The media wanted a war. They got a diplomatic statement and a 17-second video from a sergeant who said, she saved my life and meant it. I think that was the right ending. Day 243 of deployment. Day 32 of the extended stay. The Meridian's gate was back at station. My transfer was on the manifest for 1400. Iravel had been cleared for travel 2 days earlier. Her ship was also at dock. The Ascendancy transport had stayed at station through the whole period, which is a significant thing when you consider the cost and logistics of holding a royal transport in neutral space for a month. I don't think anyone in the Ascendancy had thought it would take this long. I don't think anyone had thought any of this. She was packed and ready to go, so was I. We'd said a lot of things over the previous 2 days. The important ones. The ones about what this had been and what it would be going forward, and what the word going forward even meant when you were a human soldier in the Outer Rim and a Veth princess in a 6-system Ascendancy. We'd said those things carefully and honestly, and with the help of Soveth, who had become, over the course of a month, something close to a friend to both of us, which neither of us had planned. What I remember about that morning is this. Commander Rithav came to my quarters at 800 and knocked. I opened the door. He was in full Ascendancy guard armor. He looked at me for a moment, and then he did something I didn't expect. He put his fist to his chest. The Veth military salute. Not the one they give to dignitaries, the one they give to equals. I returned it as close as I could manage given that I didn't have the right arm structure for the exact motion. He seemed to find this acceptable. He said in his stiff galactic standard, "You were not what I expected." I said, "You either." He said, "That is probably good." I said, "I think so." He left. I stood in my doorway for a minute before I finished packing.